Hi. So this is Siegfried, for those of you who are new to the channel. It's been a while, I know, but it looks like this show's really made us pull out all the stops. This is the rewrite of The Rings of Power Season 1. If you're at all interested in seeing that rewrite, but wouldn't want to understand why I'm doing this or what the context or rules are, please feel free to skip to this timestamp. If, however, you don't actually mind listening to my voice for an extra minute, please stick around, as I think that this little explanation will help your enjoyment for this series of videos. The Rings of Power wasn't great, and I think Leif has done a decent job of explaining why that is in his 7-part critique for each episode of the show. When it comes down to the show fails on a number of levels, namely it's a boring, banal, utterly bizarre, and overall poorly put together show by almost any metric of storytelling known to man. It treats Tolkien's work more as a strip mine from which it can draw references and Easter eggs rather than inspiration from which it can build a complete narrative, and it also has the chronic syndrome of so poorly using these references that the flow of the narrative is off if one doesn't understand them, while also being infuriatingly wrong if one does. From this, many of you have likely obtained the notion that I'm saying that the overall story is really the main problem rather than a particular detail. That's exactly what I'm saying, yes. In fact, the writing is so bad that almost immediately after the show ended, I came to the obvious conclusion that I could do a better job in all 3 metrics. And so, I did just that. This is my attempt at showing the showrunners and the rest of the world that I can do significantly better than Amazon's $1 billion TV show when it comes to storytelling, character interest, faithfulness to Tolkien's world, and pretty much any other form of storytelling that you can conjure. Although admittedly, the cinematography isn't going to be great in this video. However, making a Middle-earth TV show script, which is better than what we got in The Rings of Power, would simply be far too easy, so I decided to make things a little bit more difficult and interesting for myself. Therefore, I've attached the following restrictions. First, the story must take place around the same time as when the show purportedly takes place, namely circa Second Age 1600, which was when the Rings of Power were forged. 2, the same characters, or where necessary, analogues of the same characters in the show must be represented in the story. 3, said characters must roughly begin and end in the same place. Thus, Galadriel starts the story by helping to lead a company of elves north to hunt orcs, and my version of Arondir and Bronwyn will still be in a place called the Southlands, which is roughly in the same geographic location, and it will end with things like the forging of the 3 rings, Sauron and Mordor, a stranger character setting off with the main Harfoot character, etc. Though, admittedly, I did take some liberty towards the end. 4, most of the same general plot beats must be the same. So, the Southlands needs to have a battle with the orcs, Mount Doom must erupt based on the usage of a magic sword, a stranger must be going along with the hobbits, Harfoots, and the Durrnest character must have a fallout with his father by the end of the season. And 5, I am sticking to the time structure of the show, i.e. this version will be composed of 8 roughly 1-hour-long episodes. Now, I'm not going to make you guys suffer through 8 hours of listening to me talk, but I'm fairly confident that if one were to make each of these outlines into an actual show, the content for each episode would easily reach the 1-hour mark at least. Finally, I did want to be clear that if, for some reason, I were the one selected to write a Middle-earth TV show, this is not what it would look like. This also isn't what I would write if I were restricted only to what the appendices and text of Lord of the Rings said. In fact, this isn't even what I would do if I were told to write a Middle-earth TV show based on what's in Lord of the Rings, and I had to put it in the Second Age. Though, if any of you are interested in what I would do in any of those situations, feel free to let me know. I just might be able to accommodate you. Furthermore, I'm certainly not trying to imply that this is some great masterpiece of storytelling, nor am I at all saying that this is exactly what happened in Tolkien's world. Though, I will admit, while I was writing the story, I was going through the lore and found that some of my changes fit flawlessly with Tolkien's timeline. The bar I'm attempting to clear is that the story is more interesting and entertaining as a show, more faithful to Tolkien's work, and a better groundwork from which to build a complex and interesting narrative in theoretical later seasons, compared to what we actually got in The Rings of Power. In other words, this is simply my attempt at showing that I could do better than the writers for the show if I were forced to do the same general story as them. With all that out of the way, let's get to the story. For episode 1, I would simply cut the prologue, as it added little to the show other than a brief sense of visual spectacle, and what little information we were given from it generally detracted from any of the proper moral dynamics of the Second Age. If it is absolutely necessary to include the prologue, I would frame it as Elrond being approached by elf students as the lore master of Lindon. He would then sorrowfully tell the tale of the ban on the High Elves and their gradual destruction by Morgoth, until his father, Eärendil, was able to request the Valar for aid. Since this story was already in the actual show, I don't see any reason not to bring it up in the prologue, so here we are. I would then have the elves ask Elrond what happened to the orcs and other monsters after Morgoth's downfall. Elrond would mention how many of the monsters, such as the Balrogs, fled from the wrath of the Valar, though we know not where they now rest. Others, like the dragons, are found in the various corners of the world nursing their greed. But the orcs, they have largely faded into a loose set of tribes, disorganized, vicious, and cruel, as much to themselves as to outsiders. I do not doubt, he says, they soon will fade from this world unless some other dark mind and hand takes up the mantle of master for them. As he's speaking, the camera gradually rises, and we look at a map of Middle-earth in the room, which zooms in on the mountains of Angmar. From this, we transition to a relatively small elvish army led by Gil-galad, and it should be noted that if this show were not to have a prologue, which is my preferred option, this is where the show would begin. Celeborn and Galadriel are accompanying Gil-galad with their own entourage, but it's nevertheless clear that he's the one in command. Galadriel begins to speak on the prudence of committing this large of an army to their task, at which point Gil-galad points out that this mission was her idea in the first place. Celeborn then interjects, saying that her suggestion was that they discover what force leads the orcs of the north, not that they commit to a full-scale invasion. Gil-galad then points out that he has no plan or desire to occupy these lands once their task is finished. The size of his force is sufficient for any pitched battle with the remainder of the orcs in the north. But if your suspicions prove true, Galadriel, this force will still be small enough to retreat with ease when we are confronted with the greater power at work. Galadriel smiles at this, commenting on how she did well to make sure Gil-galad was the one who became High King. Gil-galad, while feigning exasperation at her insistence, nevertheless agrees that he has indeed worked hard to repay her trust in him, and that he believes he has succeeded. One of the scouts then reports to Gil-galad that the men of Angmar are besieged on a hilltop, and that they are holding out against a coalition of orc tribes. Celeborn comments on how said tribes should never have been able to cooperate, and Galadriel finishes by saying, unless there is some higher mind behind their actions. Gil-galad, with a grim expression, bids them wait until they have something more tangible for evidence. He informs his lieutenant that they ride for the encampment of men. They will rout the orcs and discover what the origin of their coalition is. We are then introduced to Varix, the king of the people of Angmar. He is a fairly short man compared to the elves, but has a strong and commanding build. He is, however, rather old and shows some mild limitations to his movement. He is going about on foot, checking each of the camps to see how well they are holding up in light of the surrounding orcs. He watches the growing camps of the orcs with his deep, intent eyes as the sky begins to darken. He then declares to his people that the orcs will attack at night. We will be ready for them, and they shall fall upon our spears like rain upon the mountain. The people cheer, and he retreats into his tent, wherein we begin to see him take off the facade, and we see him beg something, we know not what. Please, give my people the strength to last the night. Just after this prayer, we see tears begin to roll down his cheeks as he moves towards a chest in the center of his tent, and we see that he is extremely hesitant to open it. He is just about to make up his mind to do so when we hear the sounds of fighting outside, though it seems too distant to be his own men. Varix prepares himself and walks outside, but is surprised to find that the orcs are not fighting his men, but against a group of elves. He makes the snap decision to rally together his people to help them. They do so and make a charge on foot. Meanwhile, Varix climbs onto his horse and attempts to go to whom he perceives to be the commander of the force of elves, which is an elvish warrior who seems to be almost shining in his rich armor. The elf notices him, and the two talk as the battle ensues, with the orcs very rapidly breaking and retreating towards the mountains. The elf laughs at the notion that he is the commander or king of this force, and points Varix to Gil-galad, Galadriel, and Celeborn, who are overlooking the battle on a nearby hill. Galadriel and Celeborn are specifically watching for any sign of a higher authority amongst the orcs. Celeborn notes how the orcs are largely retreating into separate groups, likely along the lines of chiefdoms, which is a good thing, he points out. Galadriel agrees, displaying for a moment the sorrow of realizing your opinion might be wrong, while at the same time being relieved that your worst fears have not been realized. Gil-galad is consulting with his lieutenant, and just as they are getting ready to pursue the orcs into the mountains, the elf soldier from earlier begs leave of the High King to introduce the leader of the humans they had Gilgalad saved. Varix introduces himself with all the dignity he can muster and what little Sindarin he knows, and thanks them for the rescue. Galadriel then tells him in his own tongue that his presence is welcome among the elves and that they are more than pleased to save all the enemies of the orcs. Varix expresses his surprise that she knows his tongue, mentioning how he has heard mention of the elves in his long years, but this is the first time ever truly meeting one. I had not expected to meet even a single elf in my lifetime, and now I have been presented with a whole host of them. Galadriel smiles and thanks Varix for his courtesy, but then turns to Gilgalad and says that she and Celeborn will guide the humans to the completion of their mission. Very good, says Gilgalad. These men seem stout of heart, and similar to our great friends across the sea. I hope that they shall prove as worthy. He then speaks words of encouragement to Varix in as simple Sindarin as he can muster, which Varix seems to understand well enough, before heading off to rally the soldiers together so that they can chase after the orcs. Galadriel, after watching him go, turns to Varix and says that she has had great interest in human allies for many centuries now, and has therefore made something of an effort to learn their language. Varix says that she handles it beautifully. Celeborn admits that he's less familiar with the tongue of the Northmen than his wife, but he will no doubt prove passable for the purposes of their acquaintance. The three then follow Gilgalad's host with their entourages until they come to the mountains. There, they see that the orcs have effectively regrouped and mounted a successful defense on a large fortress built into the side of the mountain. Their defense is so successful, in fact, that the relatively small elvish force has difficulty with completely breaking through it. It is then that Varix offers his assistance, noting to Galadriel and Celeborn that these orcs generally have difficulty with properly maintaining fortresses of this scale, and therefore they should check for weaknesses in the walls. Intrigued, Celeborn asks if there's any one place in particular they should check, and Varix mentions the towers and walls closest to the rock. Celeborn then passes this information on to Gilgalad, who sends a few spies to get closer to those parts of the fortifications. Sure enough, there are a number of weaknesses in the maintenance of the stonework, though Gilgalad sees no obvious way to undermine them without building siege weapons. Varix then once again states that he might be able to help, as his people have access to weapons made just for the situation. Galadriel speaks on his behalf to Gilgalad, who accepts, and thus Varix, after crafting the plan with Galadriel, sneaks up to the side of the fortress with a couple of other men, unseen. In our next shot, we see the walls beginning to crumble, which draws the attention of the orcs away from the main gate. Then, the full might of the small elvish host assaults the main gate, and the will of the orcs to defend it vanishes. The elves get inside and find the orc defenders have broken down in terms of discipline, and are easily separated and cut down by the elves. Varix then meets up once again with Galadriel and Celeborn, and, along with Gilgalad, they begin to root out all the hidden strongholds in the fortress. A reference is made to how, if they don't do this, none could predict what evils would continue to fester in this land. Celeborn notes that there is something almost elvish about this man, referencing Varix, how he displays wisdom and strength even absent among our great scholars and warriors. After some time, a morning light begins to shine over the tops of the mountains, and an eagle can be seen circling in the air. Nevertheless, the rooting out takes several hours at least, until at last they find the great chief of this loose coalition of orcs. It seems, after this investigation, that there is no higher mind behind this orc coalition, which Varix confirms seem to have joined mainly to oppose his kingdom. Galadriel, Celeborn, and Gilgalad discuss the meaning of this in Quenya, and they are all relieved to find out that neither the Balrogs nor any other servant of Morgoth seems to be behind these orcs. We may have to accept the fact that the enemy has truly been defeated, says Gilgalad. I would not dismiss the rumors just yet, Galadriel retorts. Nevertheless, I agree. It is time for a change of tactic. If the enemy is still lurking about, he likely won't remain in the west. Not while we're here. Indeed, Celeborn says, we may very well be playing into his tricks by hunting down every small band of orcs. For now, we may need to wait and watch for larger signs. After a few other words, the three of them agree to celebrate the victory and be more cautious in their plans. After all of them have rested, they begin to discuss what to do with the fortress, eventually inviting Varix into the conversation to help them make their final decision. The others, with Galadriel at the forefront, express their desire to have it destroyed. Varix, however, asks that this fortress be left for his people. We have scarcely had the strength to create great strongholds of our own, since those skills have been lost in our war against the orcs. I believe, however, if we were to take this fortress and make it our own, we could establish a new realm for ourselves. Perhaps, one day, We could prove a formidable ally to the High King. He nods to Gil-galad as he says this, who agrees to this reasoning, and recognizes Varix as the ruler of this fortress and the surrounding lands, encouraging Galadriel and Celeborn to do so as well. After this, we see the elves preparing to move home while the people of Angmar occupy the fortress. Galadriel and Celeborn invite Varix and members of his court to come with them to celebrate the feast in Lindon. After all, they say, it seems only proper that one who has had so large a part in their swift victory today should also share in the fruits of their triumph. Varix agrees to come, knowing that he has little time left and much to learn about how to run a kingdom, and elects to bring what members of his people he can while leaving his cousin there to rule. He tells the people that he knows not how long he will be away from them, but he knows that, with the help of the elves, he will be a changed man if he returns. As the small host leaves, the eagle we saw earlier comes down to speak briefly with Gil-galad. He says that Manwë, the king of the Valar, has sent a messenger to Middle-earth, and that said messenger will be coming to Lindon within a year or so. Now, depending on whether the prologue has been kept, we are then introduced to Elrond in his study. He is performing the rather mundane, but still important task of copying a manuscript which he has been studying onto new parchment. He is silent throughout the scene, nevertheless, it is clear that his mind is at work, as he seems to come to a realization, getting up from his desk and going to check a scroll. Before he is able to do this, however, he is informed that the High King is returning. Immediately, he rises and makes preparations for the return celebrations. Gil-galad arrives at the main gate of the capital of Lindon, which can be let's just say it's Mithlund, because why not? And immediately a reverent fear of him can almost be felt amongst the elves who have come to welcome him. Elrond bows to the High King as he greets him at the gate, and graciously welcomes the Lady Galadriel and Lord Celeborn. While being respectful, he eyes Varix for a moment, who, along with his followers, looks gruff and uncultured by comparison to the rich fabrics of the elves. Galadriel introduces him as the King of Angmar, the newly established realm hard bought by the blood of his people. Elrond bows and expresses his condolences for his people's suffering. Varix, however, says that such is the way of war with a ruthless enemy, though he hopes that at long last his people's suffering has ended. Based on how eloquently he speaks, it becomes clear that Celeborn and Galadriel have been helping him practice Sindarin. Gil-galad expresses his approval, and says that if his people show the valor and cleverness they expressed these past few weeks, he has no doubt that they shall find their own path in the world. We then begin the feast. Galadriel and Celeborn are, of course, sitting next to each other on the side of the high table, with a place for Gil-galad reserved in the high seat on one end, while Varix sits on the other. One can see that he feels rather awkward and out of place amongst the grand finery in the great hall. But he also glances at his entourage, seated at another table a short distance away, and notices that they are looking to him, and therefore he musters all the propriety, courage, and dignity he can among such eminent guests. Three men, far more richly dressed than Varix and his entourage, but slightly less so than the elves, are already seated at the table. It is soon realized by Varix and his followers that these are the fabled Men of the Sea, Númenóreans. They are introduced to each other by Galadriel and Celeborn, and we learn their names. The eldest and leader of the Númenórean guests is a man named Isilmo, who is the cousin of the reigning queen of Númenor. With him is his cousin Valandil, and between them is his son Ministir. Valandil, and to some degree Ministir, express friendlier attitudes towards the people of Angmar, but Isilmo, while still adhering to the proper courtesies, expresses a largely patronizing attitude towards the people, and especially towards their king. Valandil is somewhat anxious at his cousin's treatment of their brethren, and therefore offers to walk with Varix after the feast, which Varix feels he cannot decline. Regardless, all three of the Númenóreans show great reverence even to the lowliest of elves, and are the first to stand once Elrond and Gil-galad approach the table to announce the beginning of the feast. Similar to the entrance gate of the city, the hall becomes silent once Gil-galad moves to raise his voice. Once the feast begins, Gil-galad, Celeborn, Galadriel, and Isilmo discuss the recent events throughout Eriador and beyond, and we are introduced to a variety of names and places and events, though these are largely contextualized in terms of the characters' opinions of them. Tirharad, which Varix roughly translates to near south or the Southlands for his soon-to-be scribe, is apparently a place of relative danger, though, Celeborn mentions, some of our distant brethren to the east have been assisting the lords of that land. Indeed, Valandil confirms. We have had close contact with the Sylvan elves of the area. They have done well to lift up the men of those parts. I dare say that they are one of the most prosperous people outside of Númenor and our havens here on Middle-earth. By contrast, the East is largely agreed by all present to be a dangerous place, though each speaker has a different opinion as to why. The Númenóreans attribute the trouble to the lack of high kingdoms, with only corrupt kings attempting to supplant each other. Gil-galad attributes it to the lack of high elvish presence, and Galadriel and Celeborn generally agree with Gil-galad. Nevertheless, they argue that they know fewer things about that land, and therefore there could be some power lurking there, leading the men to destruction. Gil-galad then asks Elrond for his opinion, and we see that Elrond has been intently following the discussion. We get a glimpse of the deep, thoughtful mind behind his grey eyes, somehow both quick and cautious, young and vigorous, and yet containing the memory of countless ages, beyond what he, as one of the youngest of the elves, ought to know. He waits for a moment to consider his answer before saying, "As to the true answer, we cannot be sure. However, it is clear from our mutual history that all children of Iluvatar, be they man or elf, are vulnerable to corruption, if not directly by dark powers, then to their own greed, or overlove of the good things they have made." As he says these words, we see Galadriel and Celeborn bow their heads slightly. Regardless, the strands of evil stretch far throughout the world, for the corruption of Morgoth cannot wholly be cured. I do not think it is wise to search for a single cause for the evils of any land, especially for one so far beyond our sight. It is often the case that an apparent source will show itself, but when one begins the work of eradicating it, they find the roots are much deeper and more extensive than ever before believed. Everyone at the table is impressed with Elrond's thoughtfulness, with Galadriel commenting that it is indeed foolish for them to be making declarations about a land of which they know little. Gil-galad agrees that he may have been too hasty in making his judgment about the other realms. "I shall have to think more on all the implications of your words, my friend, for you have now brought much to light which has been on my mind." After the feast, we see Gil-galad return to his chamber and Elrond to the library, at last able to find the scroll he was attempting to reach earlier. Varix and Valandil walk about the halls of Mithlond, looking out towards the sea. Valandil is explaining to him the ways of the elves and the Númenóreans, displaying the confidence that even if Varix were ill-intentioned, he would have no ability to harm the Númenóreans or the Havens. Varix listens eagerly, but eventually asks why he would tell him all this. Valandil says that, though the High Elves are gracious and joyful in their own right, at times it can be comforting to be welcomed by your own people. Varix mentions how the Númenóreans are not truly his people, which Valandil, laughing, says he supposes to be true. "And yet, we are not too different. I have heard tell that our ancestors were once one, though mine went further west, and thus fought the great war against the enemy." "Morgoth?" Varix asks. "Yes, the one who enslaved and tortured our people, and sought to either destroy or possess all that is good in the world. It pains me that so many men went over to serve him, and still do. Some of them among my ancestors and yours, but never again. Númenor may fear and hate the darkness, but we will never serve it, now that its face has been revealed." "How did your people create their own path?" Varix says suddenly. "What do you mean?" "Gil-galad spoke of my people making a path for themselves in the world, but I know not of what he speaks." "Ah, he hopes that you will one day become strong and dignified enough that you may seek after your own glories and great works. This is what Númenóreans have done. We began as a wandering people till we were granted the Isle of Gift. Since then we have made great works, and crafted a name for ourselves equal in power, though not in dignity, to the High Elves. If the tales of your valor are true, I do not doubt that you shall do this as well. But you ask how one is to accomplish this? The simple answer for now is that you must be guided by others." "How shall my people make a path for themselves if we allow ourselves to be guided by others?" "A fair question, and a great paradox it is. But think of the child. How, if not guided and taught by those who know, he remains wholly ignorant, intemperate, and unrefined. It is only if he lets himself be guided, taught, and, if you will, controlled by his parents and tutors, that he reaches his full potential. Such is the case with your people. For you are as we were when our ancestors first came to Beleriand. Children in the sight of the..." He is cut off as a messenger of Galadriel and Celeborn begs pardon for the interruption, but says that he wished to inform King Varix that he and his people are invited to stay with them during their time in Lindon. Valandil says all is well, for he has said all that needs to be said and must be going soon with his cousin to meet with the various peoples of Middle-earth. "Go, my friend," he says to Varix. "Remember what I have said, and your people shall prosper. If not in your lifetime, then those of your sons, and your sons' sons after them." Varix then goes to Galadriel and Celeborn, who are happy to see him, for he has proven himself an amiable acquaintance in their short time together. They continue to speak Sindarin, which for the purpose of the show can just be English depending on the context, and Galadriel mentions how he has done well to hide his apprehension, though not well enough to disguise it from the elves. Varix then speaks to his duties as a king, and how often he must humble himself in the sight of others for the sake of his people. "Therefore," he says, "I must ask that you teach my advisors and I, how we may best live as a free and prosperous people on this Middle-earth. Celeborn smiles at the suggestion and graciously offers to take him and his entourage to Eregion, which is their own realm once they return. At the end of the episode, we see Elrond making some connection amidst the scrolls he has taken out when Gil-galad suddenly enters the room. "High King," Elrond says, rising to pay the proper respects. Gil-galad bids him be seated and then asks him concerning the strands of evil which he spoke during the High Feast. Elrond says that he intended it as a metaphor for the corruption of the hearts which Morgoth wrought upon the world, and which persists to this day despite his downfall. "Why do you ask?" Gil-galad looks out towards the west across the sea. "I fear it may be more than mere metaphor." "How do you mean, High King?" "I have looked about these lands for many years, Elrond. Though I am not as wise or experienced as the Lady Galadriel or the Lord Celeborn, I still remember how the world felt when the sun and moon were young and before the great siege was broken. There is a change within the air. Subtle, but ever present." He then breaks off, and the two have silence for a moment. It seems that Gil-galad does not know what to say. After a few moments of silence, the two of them hear the harbor bells ringing in the distance. Elrond perks up and looks to the sea, while Gil-galad focuses on a small ship which is only just becoming visible in the morning light. An elf servant then informs the High King and his herald that it appears an envoy from Valinor is coming. "Already?" Gil-galad says in a muted voice, as the two of them begin to prepare for his arrival. The elves array themselves in as fine a manner as possible as the ship draws near. No elves are seen on the ship, and in fact, it seems to move on its own, powered by some otherworldly magic. And Galadriel comments on how it seems to shine with a grace and light to the two trees. Círdan attempts to guide the ship into the harbor, though by all appearances his help is not needed. The episode then ends with a great elf in shining armor stepping off the ship as the high elves bow in reverence to the Herald of Valinor. Varix and his people are awestruck by the mere sight of him, but we only get to see him from behind as he first steps foot upon the harbor. Alright, so that's my rewrite for episode 1. It felt a little long, but there were quite a few cinematic elements and character points which I felt I needed to set up in this episode. You might have noticed that I so far only have one plotline in this episode, and my reason for that was because I wanted a single cohesive narrative to give the viewer a sense of the world to start off. Of course, this adds the side effect of making it so that other plotlines don't have the benefit of being in episode 1, but I think that this is both more organic and has better flow to it in general. Furthermore, you may have noticed, based on the screenshots, that I've replaced Halbrand with Varix, re-added Celeborn into the story, and made Gil-galad and Elrond completely different characters compared to what they were in the actual show. The reason for this is simply that, well, these versions are significantly better and more interesting than the ones we saw in the show. And while the rules say that I have to copy where they begin and where they end off, and keep the same general story beats, they don't say that I need to keep the same personalities and character dynamics, because, well, that would be dumb. In any case, I hope you all enjoyed this bit of I guess this is fan fiction. Wait, what kind of fan fiction is this? I'm not a fan of the show. I guess this is Tolkien fan fiction? I hate myself already. I really hope this series doesn't just become another self-loathing exercise. Anyway, if you enjoyed, feel free to subscribe, as I'll be making a new one of these videos every once in a while. I've written down the story already, though I haven't gotten around to actually recording the audio yet, so I'm open to suggestions or predictions down in the comments. Though, don't worry about me changing things to outsmart you guys. I'm not the outsmarting Reddit kind of author. And with that, I hope you have all enjoyed.